the reading of my uncle's will, the man who raised me after my parents died, his lawyer looked up and said there was a provision regarding my niece Cora. My aunt, sitting across the room in her good black dress, went rigid. Because I already knew what was coming. I'd found the box in the attic 3 days earlier, and I'd already called a lawyer of my own. So when the reading was done, I stood up and said, "Before anyone leaves, I need to talk about what happened to my parents' money, all $400,000 of it. Let me back up. My name is Cora Bennett. I'm 34 years old. When I was 12, my parents died in a car accident, and the aunt and uncle who took me in spent the next 6 years stealing every dollar my parents left me, while telling me an orphan grieving child. That my parents had died with nothing, and that I should be grateful for the charity of the roof over my head. It took me 22 years to learn the truth. This is the story of how I finally found it, and what I did with it. Let me start with the worst part, so you understand the shape of this. They didn't just steal from me. They made me believe I was a burden. For 6 years, a child who had lost everything was told, daily, in 100 small ways, that she was a charity case living on someone else's generosity, while that someone else spent her dead parents' money on themselves. That psychological theft was, in some ways, worse than the financial one. They took my inheritance and then charged me my dignity as interest. My parents were not wealthy, but they were careful. My father was an electrician with his own small business. My mother was a nurse. They owned their home, they had life insurance, and they had savings, because they were the kind of responsible people who prepared for the worst, even though the worst is unimaginable. And they died instantly on a rainy highway when I was 12. They left behind a house, a life insurance policy, and an estate that all told came to about $400,000. And they left behind me their only child. I went to live with my father's sister, my Aunt Denise, and her husband, my Uncle Roger. They were my only close family, and they took me in, and on the surface it looked like an act of love. Underneath, it was an acquisition. Because here is what I didn't understand as a 12-year-old, and wouldn't understand for decades. When a child inherits an estate, someone has to manage it until the child grows up. That person is a guardian or a trustee, and they have a legal duty to protect the child's money and use it only for the child's benefit. My aunt and uncle became the guardians of my inheritance, and they treat it as their own. They told me from the beginning a lie. They told me my parents had died with debts, that there was nothing left, that the house had to be sold to cover what they owed, and that Denise and Roger were taking me in out of pure generosity, at great cost to themselves. They told me this so consistently, with such conviction, that I never questioned it. Why would I? I was a grieving child. Adults don't lie to grieving children about their dead parents, except mine did every day for 6 years, and they spent the money. I know the whole picture now. The house was sold, not to cover debts, because there were no significant debts, but for the $400,000 of equity and insurance and savings that was legally mine. And over the next 6 years, that money funded their life. Home renovation, a better car, vacations I wasn't taken on, their own children's activities, and later, college funds, their biological kids, my cousins, who were given everything while I was reminded I was a charity case. My inheritance paid for my cousins' opportunities, while I was told I couldn't afford things because I was a burden they generously absorbed. I grew up believing I owed them. I grew up small and grateful and apologetic, the orphan who'd been taken in, careful never to ask for too much, aware every day that I was a guest in a life that wasn't mine. I left for a state college on loans at 18, worked my way through, and built an independent life defined by the deep belief that I'd started with nothing and owed my very survival to my aunt and uncle's charity. That belief was a lie they'd sold me. And I lived inside it for 22 years. Here's how it finally came apart. My Uncle Roger died 2 years ago. And in the process of settling his affairs, my Aunt Denise, older now, and careless in the way people get when they think the past is safely buried, asked me to help clear out the attic of their house. The same house my parents' money had renovated. And in that attic, in a water-stained box shoved behind decades of junk, I found my parents. Not literally, but their papers. Box of documents that Denise had kept, probably out of the same instinct that makes people unable to throw away the thing that could convict them, and forgotten. And in that box was the truth, my parents' actual will, which named me as their sole heir and left me everything, and mentioned no significant debts, contradicting the entire story I'd been told. The life insurance policy, with its payout amount, made out to my parents' estate for my benefit. A sale record of my childhood home, showing it had sold for far more than any debt could have consumed. And the piece that turned grief into a case, records showing where the money had gone. Denise, it seemed, had kept her own informal records, and they showed the estate's assets flowing not to a trust for me, but into her and Roger's accounts and expenses. Bank records, the renovation invoices. It was all there in a box, in the attic, gathering water damage while I lived 22 years believing my parents had left me nothing. I sat in that attic and I did not cry at first. I was too stunned. And then I cried for a very long time, not only for the money, but for the 12-year-old who'd been told she was a burden, who'd apologized her whole childhood for existing, who'd carried a false debt for 2 decades. They hadn't just stolen $400,000. They'd stolen my understanding of who I was. And then, like every woman in every story like this, something in me went cold and clear and organized. Here's what I did. First, I took the box. All of it that day before Denise could realize what was in it. I photographed every document, made copies, and secured the originals, because I understood immediately that this box was the only proof, and that it could disappear. Second, I took it to a lawyer, an estate litigator named Marcus Hall, who handled exactly this kind of thing, breaches of fiduciary duty by guardians. And Marcus went through the box slowly, and his expression got harder with every page, And when he finished, he said, "Cora, this is one of the clearer cases of guardian misconduct I've seen. They had a legal duty to preserve this estate for you and use it only for your benefit. Instead, they told you it didn't exist and spent it on themselves and their own children. That's not just morally monstrous. It's a breach of fiduciary duty, and it's conversion theft, and the records show it in detail. The fact that it happened decades ago is a complication, but the discovery is recent, and there are doctrines that can address that. We have a real case. Third, and this is the part that mattered to me almost more than the money, I got the full accounting. Marcus brought in a forensic accountant who, using my parents' estate records and Denise's own kept documents, reconstructed the whole theft. $400,000 of my inheritance. Traced dollar by dollar into the life Denise and Roger had built, and the opportunities they'd given their own children, while telling me I was a charity case. Seeing it laid out, the exact vacations, the exact renovation, my cousin's exact college funds, all paid for with my dead parents' money, was devastating and clarifying at once. The proof was total. Now the will reading, because there was one more layer. Roger had died, and Denise had scheduled the reading of his will, a small family affair. And I went because by then I'd found the box and hired Marcus, and I knew what I had. I wanted the reckoning to happen where the whole family could witness it. The same family that had spent 22 years watching me be the grateful orphan and never questioning the story. Roger's will, it turned out, contained a provision regarding my niece Cora. A small bequest, a few $1,000s, a final gesture of generosity from the man who'd stolen $400,000 from me. A last insult disguised as kindness. Denise went rigid when the lawyer mentioned it, because Denise, unlike Roger, knew exactly what I might have found in that attic, and she was watching my face. The reading finished, and I stood up. "Before anyone leaves," I said, "I need to talk about what happened to my parents' money, all $400,000 of it." The room froze. My cousins, the ones raised on my inheritance, looked confused. Denise looked like she'd seen a ghost, which in a way she had, the ghost of the box in the attic. "For 22 years, I said, "I've been told my parents died with nothing, that the house was sold to cover their debts, and that Aunt Denise and Uncle Roger took me in out of pure generosity. I believed it. I grew up believing I was a burden, a charity case, someone who owed her survival to this family's kindness. 3 days ago, I found a box in the attic, and I learned that every word of that was a lie. I laid out the copies. My parents' real will, leaving me everything. The insurance policy, the home sale for $400,000 with no debts to cover, and the records, Denise's own records, showing where the money went. My parents left me $400,000, I said. Denise and Roger were the guardians of that money. They had a legal duty to protect it from me. Instead, they told a grieving 12-year-old her parents left her nothing, and they spent her inheritance on this house, on their cars, on their vacations, and on college funds for their own children, while telling me I couldn't afford things because I was a burden. The money that gave my cousins their opportunities was mine. It was my dead parents' last gift to me, and it was stolen. I turned to Denise. "You didn't take me in out of generosity. You took me in and took my inheritance, and you charged me my dignity for 22 years on top of it. I have a lawyer now. His name is Marcus Hall, and we have all of it. Here is how it ended." Denise tried what people try, that it was complicated, that they'd spent money raising me too, that I was twisting things, that Roger had handled the finances, and she hadn't known. But the records were her own, and a forensic accounting doesn't twist, and the difference between what it costs to raise a child and $400,000 is not a rounding error. A claim that they'd spent money on me too collapsed against the documented reality that they'd spent my money on themselves and their kids and given me loans and guilt. The case was strong. Marcus was right that the age of the theft was a complication, but the recent discovery mattered legally, and faced with her own documentation and the near certainty of losing in court, plus the reputational catastrophe of being publicly revealed as people who robbed an orphaned child, Denise settled. The settlement returned a substantial portion of what was stolen, drawn from the estate and assets my inheritance had helped build. Couldn't be all of it. 22 years is a long time, and some of it was simply gone, but it was enough to be real, enough to be justice, and enough to fund the life I'd been denied the start of. But the money, again, was never fully the point. The point was the box. The point was that the 12-year-old who'd been told she was a burden finally learned that she'd been an heiress the whole time, robbed and lied to, and that the debt she'd carried for 22 years had never existed. I gave that back to my younger self, the truth that she was never a charity case, never a burden, never owed anyone her survival. Her parents had provided for her. They loved her enough to prepare for the unthinkable. The failure was never hers and never theirs. It was the two adults who were supposed to protect her and robbed her instead. My cousins were the surprise. Two of them, once they understood that their childhoods had been funded by their orphaned cousins' stolen inheritance, were horrified, genuinely. They came to me with an apology that wasn't theirs to owe, but that I accepted anyway because they'd been children too, and the theft wasn't their crime. One of them didn't come around, preferring the comfortable version where their parents were generous. That's the realistic part. Some people can't afford the truth. Denise and I do not speak. There's nothing to say. She had 22 years to tell me the truth, to give me even a fraction of what was mine, to stop letting me believe I was a burden. And she chose, every single day for 2 decades, to keep the lie and the money. I feel no obligation to a woman who robbed a grieving child and called it charity. For 22 years, I believed I owed my survival to my aunt and uncle's generosity. The truth was in the attic the whole time, in a water-stained box, gathering damage above my head, while I apologized for existing in the house my own inheritance had paid to renovate. My parents left me everything. And even though it took 22 years and a forgotten box to find out, they did in the end reach me. Because responsible people prepare for the worst, and my parents had prepared so carefully that their love survived their deaths, survived the theft, survived 2 decades of lies. And finally found me in an attic and told me the thing my aunt and uncle spent their lives hiding. You were never a burden. You were loved. We left you everything. Go and find out who stole it. I did.